enslavement. And I use the word enslavement. I don't really like the word slavery, although I use the word slavery because it's just there and it's natural and it's been used so many times. But I use enslavement because African people were enslaved by others. Because prior to that, they had civilization. They had government. They had language and religion and all of those things. And those things were taken from them. There was always the threat of a slave rebellion in this country. As a matter of fact, there were hundreds of slave rebellions throughout the South, and it's been documented. There are books here in the library where you can find documentation of hundreds of slave revolts, not only in the South, but also in the North. And many of you have heard of people like Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, Gabriel Prosser, who led slave revolts. But there were many others. There was an incident where a slave ship known as the Creole was taken over by African people, turned around, and they went back to Africa and freed themselves. I'm sure you've heard of the Amistad Revolt. And I'm sure there are many books here at the library that talk about Joseph Sinkay and the Amistad Slave Revolt. This is one of them. It's called the Amistad Slave Revolt and American Abolition. And if you haven't seen the movie Amistad, I would recommend that's a good movie for you to see. I'll just read the first part of this. It says, in 1839, 53 West Africans brought to Cuba were sold as slaves. To seize the ship, La Amistad, the Africans seized the ship and sailed away. Their leader was Joseph Sinkay. But at night, their Spanish captors steered west, and so the Amistad zigzagged north to Long Island, New York. Here it was captured by the U.S. Navy and towed to New Haven in the slave state of Connecticut. And over the next 2 years, the Amistad incident was to write a new chapter in the history of American abolition. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but this is a very interesting story. It's been televised numerous times. There's many documentaries that have been made about the Amistad Revolt. So the whole story of Africans and their escape has really not been told as it should have been. Now notice I use Africans, and I'm talking about the 1600s, the 1700s, and the 1800s prior to the Civil War, because you have to remember they were not citizens at that time. They were not considered to be Americans, so they were African people. And so my topic is really going to talk about some slave escapes that you might not know about, but which are true and have been thoroughly documented. And I'm using this book. I've got a lot of books up here, so I will try to give you the titles as I go along. This book is called Eyewitness, a Living Documentary of the African American Contribution to American History, written by William Loren Katz. Mr. Katz has written at least 20 books, maybe more, on the contributions of African Americans. What he's most well known for is writing books about the Black West and writing books about the Black pioneers and the Black cowboys. And there were thousands of Black cowboys in the Old West. And one of his books is called Black Indians, which he talks about the Seminoles in particular that were mixed in with African people and Native Americans. So this book at one time was used as a textbook in the Buffalo Public Schools for many years, and actually before I started teaching. But somewhere along the line, people stopped using it. But I will say this is one of the best textbooks I have come across as a teacher, as a retired teacher, as a columnist, as a researcher that I have come across. Mr. Katz was Jewish. And I did hear him speak in person at Erie Community College many years ago. And someone asked him a question. I said, well, Mr. Katz, why are you writing all these books about African Americans? And he replied and said, well, I grew up in a house that appreciated African American history and culture. And my father was a great jazz enthusiast, and we had all of the great black jazz records and things in my home, and he was a former teacher in the New York City schools, and so he had an appreciation of it. And then he discovered in his teaching that a lot of information was left out of the textbooks, so he wanted to do something about that. And so that's why he wrote these books. I want to tell you about, and this is a true story, about a black man named, and he earned his nickname, Henry Box Brown. Now, in many of the textbooks, he's not mentioned, and I know this because I use a lot of textbooks in my classroom, and not only that, but I served as a reviewer on the Buffalo Public Schools textbook committee for almost 10 years. And my job being on the textbook committee was to help review all the social studies, mainly social studies textbooks, that the Buffalo Public Schools was considering to purchase. And I was put on those committees specifically to analyze the textbooks to make sure that they were telling correct information about African American history. So Henry Box Brown was a real person. And what he did, with the help of a white Southerner, he had himself mailed to freedom in a box. That's why he's called Henry Box Brown. I'm sure that at the library here they have information about him. But let me read. Now, he wrote a narrative about his experience. And this happened in 1848. And so I'm going to read this. I got to put on my glasses so I can see here. I'm going to read this narrative. And this is from the words of Henry Box Brown. He climbed into a box in Richmond, Virginia in 1848, and he had a white friend send him by express mail to Philadelphia. And here is what he said. I took my place in this narrow prison with a mind full of uncertainty as to the result. It was a critical period of my life, I can assure you. But if you have never been deprived of liberty as I was, you cannot realize the power of that hope of freedom. I laid me down in my darkened home of 3 feet by 2, just imagine that, and resigned myself to my fate. My friend was to accompany me, but he failed to do so and contented himself with sending a telegraph message to his correspondents in Philadelphia that the box was on the way. I took with me a container of water to bathe my neck in case of too great heat, and having no access to fresh water, except there was 3 small holes drilled in the top of the box. I started on my perilous cruise. I was first carried to the express office, the box being placed on its end so that I started with my head downwards, although the box was supposed to be this side up with care. From the express office, I was carried to the depot, and then I was roughly put into the baggage car, where I happened to fall right side up, no thanks to my transporters. But after a while, the car stopped, and I was put aboard a steamboat and placed on my head. In this dreadful position, I remained the space of an hour and a half, it seemed to me, when I began to feel of my eyes and head and found to my dismay that my eyes were almost swollen out of their sockets, and the veins on my temples seemed ready to burst. I made no noise, determined to obtain victory or death. I endured such a terrible pain, as well as I could, but what sustained me were the sweet thoughts of liberty. About half an hour afterwards, I attempted again to lift my hands to my face, but I found I was not able to move them. A cold sweat now covered me from head to foot. 1/2 hour longer and my sufferings would have ended that fate which I preferred to slavery. But I lifted up my heart to God in prayer, believing that He would deliver me, when to my joy I overheard 2 men say, "We have been here 2 hours and we have traveled 20 miles. Now let us sit down and rest ourselves." And guess where they sat? They turned the box over, containing my body, thus delivering me from the power of the grim messenger of death, who a few moments ago had aimed his fatal shaft at my head. One of these men inquired of the other, "What do you suppose is inside of this box?" And his comrade replied, "Well, I guess it's the mail." Yes, I thought, it is a mail indeed, although not the mail of the United States. I'm sure you all got that. M-A-L-E. Soon after this fortunate event, we arrived at Washington, where I was thrown from the wagon and I fell on my head. Pretty soon I heard someone say, "There's no room for this box. We're going to have to leave it behind." It was then that I appealed to the Lord, my help, in all of my difficulties. And in a few minutes, I heard a gentleman direct the hands to place it aboard as it came with the mail and must go on with it. So I was tumbled into the car, my head downwards again, as I seemed to be destined to escape on my head. We had not proceeded far, however, before more baggage was placed in the car, and I was again turned to my proper position. No further difficulty occurred until my arrival in Philadelphia. I assume I reached there about 3 o'clock in the morning and remained in the depot until hours later. A wagon drove up. I was soon placed in this wagon and carried to the house of my friend's correspondent, where quite a number of people were waiting for me. They were afraid to open the box at first, but at length one of them rapped upon it with a trembling voice and said, "Is all right within?" To which I replied, "All right." The joy of these friends was excessive. Each one seized hold of a tool and commenced opening my grave. At length, the cover was removed, and I arose and shook myself and thanked the Lord that I was free. This is from the narrative of Henry Box Brown, by himself, Boston, 1849. Now, I have to do a little more research to see if you have this in your library. Sometimes I do a lot of research here at the library, and there are some books that perhaps were written in the 1800s or early 1900s where you just can't go to the shelves and pull them off. You have to, if you know the title and the author, you can request it from one of the librarians, and they will sometimes get them from the stack room, which is downstairs, I'm assuming. Sometimes I use the Groverson's room over here, and there's a lot of good materials in there. Some you can't take out, some you have to use in the library. And then if I can't find what I'm looking for, if something is in the rear book room, you have to make an appointment, and I have used some materials there, but you do have to make an appointment to show your identification and so on. So it's not impossible to find these materials. The problem is you have to have a lot of patience, and you have to, you're like a detective trying to reach and push everything together. So this is a great book, and it has the story, and I'm going to be talking a little bit more about it as I go through. There's another story that I've talked about before, and maybe some of you who haven't heard this story before, I'll go over it as briefly as I can. And it's a story about two enslaved Africans who escaped to freedom by disguising themselves. This is a true story. Their names were William and Ellen Craft, and I'm sure you can get this book. It's called The Daring Escape of Ellen Craft. Actually, it's a children's book, written by Kathy Moore, spelled M-O-O-R-E. And they also wrote their own story called Running 1,000 Miles for Freedom. Now, how did they escape? Well, Ellen was a very light-skinned woman, and her husband was very dark-skinned. So they came up with the idea that she would pretend to be a Southern gentleman, and he would pretend to be her slave. They had a couple problems. She had very long hair, so William cut her hair very, very short, And he told her, he says, well, your eyes, you're really, we need to cover your eyes. So she used dark glasses, and he put a sling. She had to put her arm in a sling. And she had to pretend to be a southern white gentleman, and they found an old top hat, and there's pictures of this in the book, by the way. And William had to walk behind her because the slaves were not allowed to walk in front, and especially if it was a white woman or a light-skinned person like that, they couldn't walk side by side, and they couldn't walk in front. They had to walk in the back. So he agreed to travel as her slave. They were able to actually be very successful in this, and they got all the way to Philadelphia. And after they got to Philadelphia, they were able to rest a while. William worked as a carpenter, Ellen worked as a seamstress, and they became abolitionists, and they worked hard to help other enslaved Africans become free. William and Ellen Craft gave speeches about their escape and about the cruelties of slavery. They wanted to convince people that slavery should end. I'm reading from the book here. They became very well known in the North and the South. But however, their owners, their former owners, found out where they were, and they set bounty hunters after them. When William and Ellen Craft found out about this, they fled to England, where slavery was illegal. They started a family, and they ended up having 5 children. They continued to give speeches. They even wrote the book that I held up here, Running 1,000 Miles to Freedom, The Escape of William and Ellen Craft from Slavery. It was published in 1860. After the Civil War, they returned to the United States, and they went to Georgia in 1870, and they built a school for black children. And they worked very hard, but after a while, they received a lot of threats from whites in a nearby area, and they had to move to Charleston, South Carolina, where they lived their final days in peace. So this is a very good story, The Daring Escape of Ellen Craft, and I think you will find it interesting to read all of the details. There was another story, and I have another book here, which I actually purchased after. Sometimes when I find that there's some really good books, I will just purchase the books just to have them as a part of my own personal library, as if I need to have any more books, because I have a lot. My house looks like a library all by itself. And it's called Freedom Roads, Searching for the Underground Railroad, written by Joyce Hanson and Gary McGowan. And in this book, it talks about people like William Still, who was a very, very famous abolitionist in the late 1800s, and right here in Buffalo, too. Sometimes I talk about a lot of history, but I also like to come back locally, because right here in Buffalo, we had William Wells Brown, who was an abolitionist, who helped many slaves to freedom, who worked on the Erie Canal, and who lived on the site where my church is right now. My church is the First Shiloh Baptist Church. It's located less than 10 minutes ride from here at 15 Pine Street. And right in front of my church there is a historical marker stating that this was the site of the home of William Wells Brown, and that he was an abolitionist movement, and he helped many slaves to freedom. I often point that out to people because sometimes people see these markers and they don't really take the time to read them, and they don't know what they're all about. So, if slaves were able to get to a place called Ripley, Ohio, and I'm going to read a little bit about that, they can consider themselves free. So why was Ripley, Ohio? Here, I'm going to read this to you. It was situated in a place called Brown County, Ohio. Ripley was a freedom zone for slaves escaping across the Ohio River from Kentucky. 2 of the best-known anti-slavery workers in Ripley were John Rankin and John P. Parker. Rankin was a minister who was active in the anti-slavery movement. His home in Ripley was on the top of a hill that could be seen by people who were escaping across the river. It was a refuge and a hiding place for runaway slaves. It was said that the light of a lantern in the window of the Rankin home, as well as other homes on the north shore of the Ohio River, was a signal that runaway slaves could help. John Rankin and his wife helped refugees from slavery from 1825 through the Civil War. The house is now a historic landmark. John D. Parker purchased himself, paying $1,800 in Alabama to the man who owned him. He was a skilled iron worker, and he opened a foundry in the 1850s. The one thing that a lot of people, when we talk about enslavement, don't realize is there were a lot of free blacks, even right here in western New York. There were free blacks who lived in the area around Michigan and Broadway and William. However, in 1850, they had to leave Buffalo right away. Does anybody know why? Well, because of the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law in 1850 that was signed by President Millard Fillmore that said anyone found giving shelter to fugitive slaves could be imprisoned or could face a very harsh fine. So when that law was passed, that was when a lot of slaves, or not slaves, but that's when a lot of African people decided to leave this area and cross over to Canada for freedom. Because even though they were free, they always had to be on the lookout for bounty hunters, because the bounty hunters would make their way to this part of the area to try to take these people back south and earn money for doing that. So they had to be very, very careful. I'm going to stop just a minute and I'm going to show you a clip from a film called Race Toward Freedom. I'm just going to show a little bit of it, because sometimes I like to show these films because I have hundreds of films myself. But because this is in the middle of something, let me just give you a little background. This is a scene where a white abolitionist has gone south and he visited a plantation and he pretended to be a bird watcher, when in fact he was not a bird watcher, he was actually an abolitionist. And he helped the slaves, he helped about 6 slaves on the plantation become free, but then he was found out, and so he was in trouble for that. So we'll see just a little bit of that. This is called Race Toward Freedom.